Hey, welcome back. Today we're looking at Machiavelli's The Prince. If you've been following along with my Shakespeare 2020 read-through, you may wonder why I'm deviating from Shakespeare. The fact is, I read Machiavelli's The Prince at first because I was interested in the way Shakespeare was using Machiavelli's ideas in order to explore and create character. I've long heard about the influence of Machiavelli on both politics as well as literature, but until this year I'd not read him. But in the midst of my Shakespeare studies, as I see Richard III continually talk about himself as a Machiavel, I felt that it was probably time that I better understood the source. Whether you're interested in Machiavelli because of his influence on Shakespeare, or just because he's so famous and so well known, I highly recommend you take the time to read the whole book. I've heard quotes and summaries of the book my whole life, but it's well worth the read. Given everything that people say about it, I'd always heard it was sort of almost like a villain's handbook. How to be a really evil, devious ruler. Which I think was not an accurate description, but that's the way it came across, at least in Shakespeare's day. Machiavelli is very interested in power and control of the state, but although his methods at times contradict what people would see as nobility and idealism, he doesn't straight up advocate evil. At least not for the sake of being evil. Some of the biggest issues that his early readers had, as well as Shakespeare and Elizabethan England would have with Machiavelli, are the fact that he excuses cruelty when it's necessary. He downplays morality, idealism, and even the good of the state. He also excuses lying and manipulating, which all sound pretty bad. However, they make much more sense in the context he's setting them. The most important aspect of this book is that Machiavelli is pragmatic. He's interested in what it practically takes to rule a kingdom, and to keep that rule. How to gain power and hold power. In that way, a prince must be very self-interested. And yet, at the same time, the interests of the prince mostly co-align with the good of the people. A good, strong, stable ruler will create a good, strong, stable state. Therefore, the people will ultimately be happier with a good ruler rather than a weak or fragile one. They're also happier with a ruler who's going to continue to hold power rather than one who's going to lose power, causing unrest and civil war. Therefore, a good, strong state will be governed by a good, strong, powerful leader. And if that ruler's motives are fairly selfish, well, it works out anyway. Machiavelli lived in the late 15th century, early 16th century, roughly 50 years before Shakespeare. The Prince was published in 1513. And Machiavelli himself was interested in the state. He was an advisor to princes for a while, but through a series of misfortunes and jealousies, got kind of pushed to the side. On the sidelines, he was a keen observer of everything going on, and he used those observations to create basically a playbook for a ruler. They are somewhat cynical, very pragmatic, and very sharp. He's fascinating to read, not at all dull. His advice is straight to the point, clever, and full of excellent examples. He uses both good and bad examples to back up each of his points. The book is also, not very thick. It's a quick read and can be done in one good setting, but it also can be slowly poured over and enjoyed. Throughout the book, at least until the last chapter, he also maintains a more or less disinterested tone. He's not vying for power. He's merely the outside observer, commenting upon everything happening here. And sure, you can almost see a tiny smirk on his face as he's doing all of this, but he still manages to convey all of his ideas in a very straightforward manner. The most important thing he does is shatter the concept that idealism is an effective way of establishing a ruler. Sure, all the people want a ruler who will be good, who will do what's right, who will be moral, who will care about them in his heart. But that's just not very practical, Machiavelli says. Sure, policies are easier to implement if your populace has idealistic visions. Those who are idealistic and naive will more readily listen to you. But you must have a more open-eyed lack of naivety if you are going to really rule the government. Or study the government. He's got a critical, pragmatic eye through it all. The Prince could be divided into more or less 4 sections. Chapters 1 through 11 deal with what a prince is and the different kinds of princes. Now, when Machiavelli says the prince, he's talking about any strong dictator ruler, more or less. What does that have to do with democracy, you might ask? Well, anyone who gains power, whether or not he's got the vote and the approval of the people, is still a ruler and a prince. Do we still have princes like this in our modern governments? Well, sure. Anybody who gains a massive amount of power over the state could be, under Machiavelli's definition, a prince, even if he doesn't have the title of royalty. President could be a prince. The CEO of a huge company with massive lobbying power in government could be considered a prince. It's the one who's pulling the strings of power within a state. Machiavelli examines the difference between hereditary power and new power, as well as some of the other nuances such as ecclesiastical power, when the popes really had a lot of charge of Italy, which gives some interesting comment on the relationship between religion and power. It's funny that every time Machiavelli comes across the idea of a higher power, like God or religion, or even fortune or luck, he says, yes, that exists, but let's just put it to the side because this is the way things really work. So God may be supporting your ecclesiastical power, and yet a lot of your power is also coming from the way you treat your people, the way you treat your enemies, how you lay out your plans and prepare, etc. In these chapters, he also talks about rising to power, and the way a new prince rises to power, and the implications of that. A system and authority that's been in place for a long time is harder to shake because the people are just used to it. They have to really hate it before it crumbles. Machiavelli's quick to point out that people who have been suppressed are easy to re-suppress, whereas people who have a lot more freedom tend to be harder to rule and control. Coming to new power is difficult, as he says in chapter 6. And it ought to be remembered that there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things. Because the innovator has for enemies all those who have done well under the old condition, and lukewarm defenders in those who may do well under the new. The coolness arises partly from fear of the opponents, who have had the laws on their side, and partly from the incredulity of men, who do not readily believe in new things until they have had a long experience of them. Think about how hard it is to have big change in government, big change in the way of things. See how relevant he is still even today? He also points out the difference between coming to power through military might and coming to power through luck. He has a lot to say about fortune, and mostly he discounts it. You sometimes just stumble into things, but unless you've really prepared for it, and unless you have a sincere game plan, that's going to slip through your fingers quickly. He also matter-of-factly talks about people who come to power through wickedness. And he's completely unjudgmental about it. If you come through power by manipulating and killing, no big deal. This is how it works, this is how you retain power. These are some good examples of good rulers who came to power through wickedness. He points out that treachery and cruelty is a fine way to rise to power as long as you do it right. Here's how you deal with cruelty in your rise to power. He says in chapter 8 that cruelty may be properly used, if of evil it is possible to speak well, that are applied at one blow and are necessary to one's security, and that are not persisted in afterwards, unless they could be turned to the advantage of the subjects. The badly employed are those which, notwithstanding they may be few in the commencement, multiply with time rather than decrease. Those who practice the first system are able, by the aid of God or man, to mitigate in some degree their rule. So it's fine to be cruel as long as it fills a certain window, gets you in place, but then don't continue to be cruel. That's just going to lead to problems. Also, if you're going to be cruel, just do it once and be done with it, for injuries ought to be done all at one time, so that, being tasted less, they offend less. Benefits ought to be given little by little, so that the flavor of them may last longer. He also differentiates between the nobles, or the powerful people in your country, and the populace, the general people. How you treat both is important. You have to balance the nobles, because they're the ones who can take your place. But the populace, you also have to keep in a certain mood. Over and over and over again throughout the book, he emphasizes that you don't want the people to hate you. That's really important. They don't have to love you, but they shouldn't hate you. If they hate you, then you're in big trouble. Mostly you keep them from hating you by not oppressively abusing them. Specifically, don't kill their families and take their property. Also, if you can get them to admire you, that's nice. But it's hard to get everyone to admire you. He more or less concludes this section by pointing out the two things that make a prince strong. One is military might, and two is not being hated by the people. The second section of the book is chapters 12 through 14, which deal with the different kinds of armies and military power that a prince can have. It describes several different kinds of armies. There are your own armies, there are mercenaries, there are auxiliary armies, more or less another country coming in and helping you with their army, and a mixture of those things. Machiavelli really emphasizes using your own army. Have a strong military force. Because if you don't have the strength, somebody's going to take it from you. You borrow strength from other countries, that's only going to be giving up your power, and ultimately going to come back to bite you. Even if an auxiliary army or a mercenary army does help you, ultimately they also weaken you. He concludes this section in chapter 14 by talking about the ways a prince should always study conflict and war, especially in peacetime. You don't spend your peacetime celebrating the fact that you're at peace. You spend peacetime planning for the next war. Why? Because the only way to maintain power is to continue to hone your edge. In chapter 14 he says, "A prince ought to have no other aim or thought, nor select anything else for his study than war and its rules and discipline. For this is the sole art that belongs to him who rules, and it is of such force that it not only upholds those who are born princes, but it often enables men to rise from a private section to that of rank." He says, if you disarm yourself, you're going to be despised. So either practice war or study it at all times. What about the arts? What about the fun? What about the peaceable activities? He's going to have 2 paragraphs about those later on. But more or less, they aren't that important if you really want to maintain power. Your goal should entirely be holding on to power. He finishes the chapter by saying, "A wise prince ought to observe some such rules, and never in peaceful times stand idle, but increase his resources with industry, in such a way that they may be available to him in adversity, so that if fortune chances, it may find him prepared to resist her blows." More on fortune later. The third section is probably the most fun, and it deals with the character of the prince. So, we've said what are princes, we've shown how princes hold and gain power. Now, we need to look at what a prince should act like. And this is the part where Machiavelli says, yeah, there's lots of books on how to be a good ruler, and most of them are garbage because, after all, they mostly tell you you ought to be a good person. That's not really true. He says in chapter 15, "But, it being my intention to write a thing which shall be useful to him who apprehends it, it appears to me more appropriate to follow up the real truth of the matter than the imagination of it. For many have pictured republics and principalities which, in fact, have never been known or seen, because how one lives is so far distant from how one ought to live, that he who neglects what is done for what ought to be done, sooner effects his ruin than his preservation. For a man who wishes to act entirely up to his profession of virtue soon meets with what destroys him among so much that is evil." Nice guys finish last in real life. Hence, it is necessary for a prince wishing to hold his own to know how to do wrong, and to make use of it, or not, according to necessity. Not that you should just straight be evil, but you should know how to be evil if the occasion merits it. This might be where we get all of our anti-heroes. He dedicates a chapter to the difference between liberality, or generosity, and meanness, or frugality. People tend to like a generous person, but he says generosity is going to just sink your economy and hurt your people, and then you'll have to raise taxes and everybody's going to hate you. So, basically, you be generous whenever you conquer another country. You take all their stuff and you give it away, that's fine. But don't ever give away your stuff, or your country's stuff. It's just going to hurt you. And then he talks about the difference between cruelty and clemency. And here we get probably the most famous quote from this book. "Upon this a question arises, whether it is better to be loved than feared, or feared than loved. It may be answered that one should wish to be both, but because it is difficult to unite them in one person, it is much safer to be feared than loved, when, of the two, either must be dispensed with." That quote is, of course, incredibly famous because, hey, you don't have to love me, you just have to be afraid of me. But remember the context. Because although that sounds awful, you also have to remember that a prince should never be hated by his people. And cruelty, just for the sake of cruelty, is not a good method according to Machiavelli. So sure, people should be a little bit afraid of you because you have such control and power, not necessarily because you are a jerk. He goes on and says, "Nevertheless, a prince ought to inspire fear in such a way that, if he does not win love, he avoids hatred, because he can endure very well being feared whilst he is not hated, which will always be as long as he abstains from the property of his citizens and subjects and from their women. But when it is necessary for him to proceed against the life of someone, he must do it on proper justification, for manifest cause. But above all things, he must keep his hands off the property of others. Do things for a purpose, for a justified reason, and don't just steal things from people, and don't just crush and kill people for no reason. Yet, let the people know that you could if you wanted to. But if everybody just loves you, then they might take advantage of you. Chapter 18 is also fascinating, in which he talks about faith. And this is one of the great points that Shakespeare borrows in creating the character of Richard III. Machiavelli says, your faith and faithfulness to religion, meh, they don't matter. However, you do need to appear as though you have faith. Listen to what he says. Nevertheless, our experience has been that those princes who have done great things have held good faith of little account, and have known how to circumvent the intellect of men by craft, and in the end have overcome those who have relied on their word. It is fine for you to break your promises up and down. Everybody else does anyway. He says, if men were entirely good, this precept would not hold. But because they are bad, it will and will not keep faith with you. You are not bound to observe it with them. Since people are inherently jerks, it's okay for a prince to be a jerk. In fact, it's necessary. But he goes on to talk about appearances, saying, but it is necessary to know well how to disguise this characteristic, and to be a great pretender and dissembler. And men are so simple and so subject to present necessities that he who seeks to deceive will always find someone who will allow himself to be deceived. A little bit further, therefore it is unnecessary for a prince to have all the good qualities I have enumerated, but it is very necessary to appear to have them. And I shall dare say this also, that to have them and to always observe them is injurious, and that to appear to have them is useful. To appear merciful, faithful, humane, religious, upright, and to be so, but with a mind so framed that should you require not to be so, you may be able and know how to change to the opposite. That's definitely the point that blew everyone's mind who first read this book. He concludes the section on the character of the prince in a chapter on being hated, which is, of course, the biggest sin to Machiavelli. Of everything else, you should make sure you aren't hated, because if people hate you, then they will conspire against you. Wise princes have taken every care not to drive the nobles to desperation, and to keep the people satisfied and content, for this is one of the most important objects a prince can have. He also talks about another group of people, his soldiers, his armies. You need your soldiers to be happy and to like you, and you also need the people to be happy and like you, and sometimes there's a clash between those two groups. It was a hard thing to give satisfaction both to soldiers and people, because the people loved peace, and for this reason they loved the unaspiring prince, whilst the soldiers loved the warlike prince, who was bold, cruel, and rapacious, which qualities they were quite willing he should exercise upon the people, so that they could get double pay, and give vent to their own greed and cruelty. He says, you're gonna be hated by someone, so you should definitely avoid being hated by everyone. And to exert some control over who hates you is really important. Notice the idea of military versus people. Brutality and warlikeness versus those who love peace. How do you balance both of those? How do you make both those groups happy, or find a happy medium? He's going to give loads of examples to help you navigate through that balance. And reading that section again reminds me how apropos Machiavelli is to current events, even though he's 500 years old. The last section of the book, chapters 20 through 26, deals with how a prince functions in the state. Besides fighting and gaining power, what else does a prince do? Do you arm your people? Do you build fortifications or tear them down? How do you deal with your advisors and other people who work with you? In this section, he also talks about ways to continue in power, and the pros and cons of all those different ways. Most of the topics that he talks about in this last section are things that vary case by case. You have to know how to deal with things in your own situation. Sometimes it's good to have lots of fortification. Sometimes it's good to arm all your people. Sometimes it's not. It depends on your position, your place, and a lot of other factors. He points out that sometimes it's even advantageous to cause tension within your state because it helps you to maintain a bit of control. But that can also backfire and hurt you. When people are afraid, they're easier to control. Or cultivating an exterior enemy. Hey, those people over there are our enemy. We need to be prepared to fight them. Causes your people to unite and gives them something to do to prepare for. He also talks about how to win over allies, and what kind of allies will be the strongest and last the longest. Mostly he advises that a prince should always be pursuing action, because it gives you renown, it makes the people respect you, it makes your army respect you. And so a good prince tends to pick more fights, or at least get himself involved in more fights. If there's two other countries who are messing with each other, get involved. Neutrality tends to hurt you more than action. At the end of chapter 21, he consigns 2 paragraphs to peaceful activity, including having festivals for the people and providing for the arts. More or less, he says, those are good things for people, and you should, like, you know, do little cameos of yourself there, but don't hang out with the people too much because they might lose their respect of you. That's all fine and good. Now get back to working on military stuff. Chapters 22 and 23 deal with your secretaries and your advisors, and how to choose good advisors, but also how to avoid flatterers. He points out that it's most important for the prince to be wise and intelligent himself. Otherwise, you're not going to choose good advisors, and you're going to wind up being hurt by their advice. Either because they will take power away from you, or try to control you, or they will give you so much mixed advice that you won't know what to do with it. So you being wise is more important. However, there's a narrow line to walk. It's important that you listen to people, but not that you listen to too many people. Machiavelli advises that you have your handful of hand-picked advisors. These are the only ones who are allowed to give you advice. And they should give you advice only on the things that you ask of them. And they should always tell you the complete truth. And so you reinforce that with them. But you also don't let anyone else advise you. Because if everyone can advise you, then people will respect you less, and you'll have a lot more flatterers trying to whisper in your ear. This section reminded me a lot of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, the whole idea of flattery with Julius Caesar and the way he was manipulated by the conspirators. His last few chapters talk specifically about how states can lose power. And in chapter 25, he focuses on fortune, or luck. How sometimes things are out of your control. But he mostly blows that off and saying, you know what, you could avoid a lot of disaster, a lot of this bad luck, if you just prepared ahead of time. If you're constantly prepared, then these things wouldn't catch you off guard. Listen to his description. I compare fortune to one of those raging rivers, which, when in flood, overflows the plains, sweeping away trees and buildings, bearing away the soil from place to place. Everything flies before it, all yield to its violence, without being able in any way to withstand it. And yet, though its nature be such, it does not follow therefore that men, when weather becomes fair, shall not make provision, both with defences and barriers, in such manner that, rising again, the waters may pass away by canal, and their force may neither be so unrestrained nor so dangerous. So it happens with fortune, who shows her power where valor has not prepared to resist her, and thither she turns her forces, where she knows that barriers and defenses have not been raised to constrain her. So if you just spend a little bit more time preparing for eventualities, you won't have to deal with so many problems. Sometimes bad luck happens, but you adapt and you change. The more flexible you are, the more prepared you are, the better off you're going to be. The last chapter is a particular admonition. He's trying to cause change in Italy, and up to this point he's been, as I said, disinterested. And yet, in the last chapter, he's urging for a new prince to rise in Italy. Take advantage of the turmoil, drive out these barbarians, and let's take control of the state again. It's a book that surprised me in many ways and was well worth reading and rereading. Not only does it help me understand the classic plays of Shakespeare, but it also gives me a way of glancing at and understanding some of the power of the world around me, and why it always seems that politicians, even the ones with the sweetest tongues, are horrible jerks, especially the ones with the most power.
Remember, if you're able to participate in the electoral process, that your leaders probably don't care about you, and are perfectly willing to manipulate you for their own purposes and power. So make sure that whoever you choose, it's someone you won't absolutely hate. And if it depresses you to think about how manipulative and awful most world rulers are, you can always go read Dante and see the creative punishments he comes up with for the power-hungry and corrupt leaders.
Thanks for watching. If you like the idea of a Machiavellian ruler, I highly recommend reading Richard III. Or, as soon as I can get it up, watching my video over it. Or reading some of Shakespeare's other power plays, like Julius Caesar, or his histories. And I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.